The white prairie dress was a lie. It was meant to suggest purity, a blank canvas upon which the town of Harmony Creek, Montana, could project its assumptions of quiet, docile femininity. For Lynn, at 18 years of age, it felt more like a burial shroud. The cotton was stiff, starched to an unforgiving crispness by her stepsister Clara, and every movement produced a faint rustling sound that seemed to scream for attention in a room where she was commanded to have none. Her father, Mr. Chin, had made his instructions clear in the rattling wagon on the way to the annual Founders' Dinner. He hadn't looked at her, his eyes fixed on the dusty rumps of the horses. "Clara is the family's future in this town," he'd said, his voice as dry as the summer earth. "She will speak with the Abernathys. She will laugh with the mayor. She will shine. You," he finally turned, his gaze a sharp, pointed instrument, "will be a shadow. You will sit. You will smile when smiled at. You will not offer a single word unless you are asked a direct question, and then your answer will be brief. Do you understand me, Lynn?" Lynn had simply nodded, her throat too tight for words anyway. Understanding was a currency she had long since learned to trade in. She understood that her father, a man who had built a successful freight business from nothing, saw his daughters as assets. Clara, with her blonde hair, blue eyes, and easy American charm inherited from her late mother, was a prime commodity. Lynn, the daughter of his first wife, a quiet woman who had brought with her the scent of herbs and the weight of a world he was desperate to leave behind, was a complication. A silent, dark-haired reminder of his otherness. The town hall buzzed with a heat that had little to do with the July evening. Lanterns cast a warm yellow glow over long plank tables laden with roasted chickens, bowls of potato salad, and deep-dish apple pies. The air was thick with the competing smells of sawdust, perfume, and sweat. Lynn sat beside Clara at the long table reserved for the town's more prosperous families. Clara was already holding court, her laughter a bright, tinkling bell that drew the attention of young men in stiff collars and older matrons with watchful eyes. Lynn kept her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the patterns in the wood grain of the table. She could feel the stares. They were not malicious, not always. They were curious, the way a person might look at an exotic bird in a cage. She was Mr. Chin's Chinese daughter, a fixture in the background of Harmony Creek, seen but rarely heard. To speak would be to break the illusion. She risked a glance across the crowded room. Men stood in clusters, talking livestock prices and railroad expansion. Women gathered to trade gossip and recipes. And then her eyes found him. Arthur Vance. He was a rancher who owned a sizable piece of land north of town, a place of rolling hills and stubborn soil that he worked mostly by himself. He was known for his silence, a trait that in him was considered thoughtful and steady, while in her it was deemed peculiar. He wasn't handsome in the way Clara's suitors were, with their polished boots and easy smiles. His face was weathered by the sun and wind, his hands were large and calloused, and he moved with a slow, deliberate economy that suggested a great reserve of strength. He was sitting with a few other ranchers, but he wasn't talking. He was listening, his head slightly inclined, but his eyes were not on the speaker. They were on her. A jolt went through Lynn, sharp and unnerving. It wasn't the predatory gaze of other men she sometimes felt, a look that assessed and dismissed. His was different. It was quiet, observant, and held a question she couldn't name. She quickly dropped her eyes back to the table, her heart hammering against her ribs. The white dress suddenly felt suffocating. When she dared to look up again a few moments later, he was still watching. He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a simple acknowledgment, a greeting offered across a chasm of noise and expectation. Before she could react, her father's voice sliced through the air from further down the table. "Clara, my dear, Mr. Abernathy was just asking about your beautiful embroidery." Lynn shrank back into herself. The moment was broken. She was a shadow again, and the shy rancher across the room was just another person she was not allowed to know. She did not yet understand that his quiet attention was a single stone that would soon trigger an avalanche. The dinner wore on. Speeches were made. The mayor praised the town's resilience. Mr. Abernathy, the wealthiest man in the county, spoke of progress and opportunity. Lynn ate mechanically, the food tasteless in her mouth. She felt a growing pressure behind her eyes, the familiar ache of being erased. It happened without warning. Mr. Henderson, the town's elderly blacksmith, a man whose booming laugh was as much a fixture of Harmony Creek as the church steeple, was in the middle of a story. His face, already ruddy from the heat and the whiskey, suddenly went pale. He clutched his chest, his eyes wide with a confusion that quickly turned to panic. A choked gasp escaped his lips, and he slumped forward, scattering a plate and a glass of water onto the floor with a loud clatter. Silence fell over the hall, immediate and absolute. Then came the eruption of panicked voices and the scraping of benches as people surged to their feet. "Give him air!" someone shouted. "Is he breathing?" cried a woman. "Where's Doc Miller?" A man near the front answered, his voice tight with alarm. "He's over in Bozeman. Won't be back for 2 days." Chaos took hold. People crowded around the fallen man, offering useless advice. Clara stood with a hand to her mouth, her face a mask of pretty distress. Mr. Chinn rushed to Mr. Abernathy's side, his expression one of deep concern for the disruption to the evening's decorum. Lynn remained seated for a half-second, her father's command echoing in her mind. "Be a shadow. Say nothing." But she saw what the others did not. She saw the bluish tint to Mr. Henderson's lips, the faint, fluttering pulse in his neck. She recognized the signs. Her mother had shown her, in their small garden behind the freight office, which plants could calm a frantic heart, which leaves could ease a fever, and how to read the language of a body in crisis. "This is not your place," a voice in her head warned. But the sight of the blacksmith, a man who had always given her a kind smile and never seemed to notice her silence, spurred her to move. The image of her mother, her hands stained with soil and wisdom, gave her the courage. She stood up. The rustle of her dress seemed deafening. She moved toward the circle of panicked townspeople, her steps small but determined. "Step aside," she said. Her voice was quiet, rusty from disuse, but it cut through the noise. Heads turned, eyes widened. Her father's head snapped around, his face contorting with fury. "Lynn, get back to your seat, now!" She ignored him. She pushed gently through the crowd until she knelt beside Mr. Henderson. His breathing was shallow, ragged. She placed 2 fingers on his wrist, feeling for the weak, thready pulse. "Someone loosen his collar," she ordered, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "And I need a cup of cool water, not cold." A few people stared, dumbfounded. Who was this girl to be giving orders? But the blacksmith's wife, her face streaked with tears, immediately began fumbling with her husband's collar. Her father grabbed her arm. "I told you to be silent," he hissed, his grip like a vice. "You are embarrassing this family." "Let her go." The voice was low and calm, yet it carried the weight of command. Arthur Vance stood behind her father. He hadn't pushed or shouted. He had simply placed himself between Mr. Chinn and Lynn. His eyes were fixed on her father, and for the first time Lynn saw a hardness in them that was as unyielding as granite. Mr. Chinn, a man accustomed to being obeyed, faltered. He looked from the quiet rancher to the ring of watching faces and back to his daughter, who was now ignoring him completely. He released her arm as if it had burned him. Arthur knelt on the other side of Mr. Henderson. "What do you need?" he asked Lynn, his voice for her alone. "The water," she said, not looking at him. and I need him on his back, flat." Together, they gently eased the large man onto the floor. Someone handed Arthur a cup of water, and he held it while Lynn dipped her fingers in it and moistened the blacksmith's lips and forehead. She began to speak to him in a low, soothing tone, the words a mix of English and the dialect her mother had used, a calming murmur that had nothing to do with meaning and everything to do with sound. She placed one hand on his chest, feeling the frantic, irregular rhythm of his heart. She knew what to do. There was a small pouch sewn into the inner seam of her dress, a secret place where she kept a few dried hawthorn berries and a pinch of motherwort. Her mother had called them heart's ease. It was a foolish, sentimental thing to carry, but she had never been able to part with it. "I need to make a tea," she said, looking up at Arthur. "Boiling water, quickly." He didn't question her. He stood, his large frame a protective barrier around her, and his gaze swept the room. "You heard her," he said, his voice resonating with an authority no one had expected. "Boiling water, now." Several people scrambled to the kitchen. The town watched, mesmerized, as the quietest girl and the quietest man in Harmony Creek took control. Lynn worked with a focused intensity that transformed her. She was no longer a shadow. She was a point of stillness in a storm, her hands moving with a knowledge that was deep and certain. When the hot water arrived, she crushed the berries and herbs in a clean handkerchief and steeped them, the faint, earthy aroma rising in the tense air. With Arthur's help, she carefully tilted Mr. Henderson's head and managed to get a few sips of the warm liquid past his lips. For a long time, nothing happened. The silence in the hall was thick with doubt and fear. Lynn could feel her father's rage burning into her back. Then she felt it. Under her palm, the blacksmith's heartbeat began to steady, losing its frantic, fluttering quality and settling into a slower, more regular rhythm. A little color returned to his face. His eyes flickered open, confused but aware. A collective sigh of relief washed through the room. The blacksmith's wife began to sob, this time with gratitude. Arthur looked at Lynn, and in his eyes she saw not just respect, but a profound understanding. He saw her. Not the shadow, not the Chinese girl, but the person she truly was. As people began to murmur their thanks and disbelief, her father shoved his way through. His face was a thunderous mask. He grabbed her by the elbow, his fingers digging into her flesh. "We are leaving," he stated, his voice dangerously low. He didn't spare a glance for the recovering blacksmith. His only concern was the spectacle his daughter had made. He dragged her toward the door, past the stunned faces of the townspeople, past Clara's bewildered stare, and out into the cool night air. The walk to the wagon was a blur of shame and defiance. He threw her into the seat and took the reins, snapping them with a vicious crack that sent the horses lurching forward. The ride home was conducted in a terrible, suffocating silence. The moon was high and bright, illuminating the prairie in shades of silver and gray. Lynn stared out at the landscape, her arm throbbing where her father had grabbed her. She should have been terrified. She had disobeyed a direct order, shattered the fragile peace of her existence, and invited a wrath she knew would be monumental. But as the wagon rattled on, a strange and unfamiliar feeling began to bloom in her chest. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, more solid. It was the feeling of her own 2 feet planted firmly on the ground. For the first time in her life, she had not been a shadow. She had been seen. And the person who had seen her was the one man who understood the value of silence. The moment they were inside their modest house, the door barely shut behind them, her father's control finally broke. "What did you think you were doing?" he roared, his voice echoing in the small front room. He advanced on her, his face flushed with anger. "You humiliated me. You made a fool of this family." "I helped him," Lynn said, her own voice surprising her with its steadiness. "You played the peasant witch with your weeds and superstitions," he spat. "In front of Abernathy, in front of everyone. I have spent 10 years building a reputation in this town, trying to make them forget where we came from. I gave you one simple task, be invisible, and you chose tonight, of all nights, to make a spectacle of yourself." Clara, who had followed them in, watched from the doorway, her expression a mixture of fear and a faint, cruel satisfaction. "Father, she was only trying to—" "Stay out of this, Clara," he snapped without looking at her. His focus was entirely on Lynn. "Abernathy is considering a partnership, a freight contract that would secure our future here. His son has taken a liking to Clara. Everything was proceeding perfectly, and you, with your mother's nonsense, you drew every eye." He was pacing now, a caged tiger. "They don't see a healer. They see a strange Chinese girl doing strange things. It makes them nervous. It makes them remember that we are different. Abernathy values order, propriety. He will not want to be in business with a man whose daughter causes a scene at a public dinner." Lynn stood her ground, her hands clenched at her sides. "Mr. Henderson was dying. There are doctors for that." "The doctor is in Bozeman," she replied calmly. "He would have been dead by the time a rider got halfway there." Her logic only infuriated him more. He stopped in front of her, his shadow looming over her. "Your mother filled your head with this foolishness. This is not her world. This is America. Here a woman's value is in her silence, her obedience, and the quality of the match she can make. You have compromised Clara's chances. You have compromised my business. You have compromised everything." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "From now on, you will not leave this house except to go to the store for supplies. You will not speak to anyone. You have proven you cannot be trusted to be a shadow. So I will put you in a cage." The finality in his tone was like a door slamming shut. Lynn felt the air leave her lungs. This was worse than being invisible. This was being buried alive. She turned and fled to her room, a small, sparse space at the back of the house, and shut the door, leaning against it as tears of rage and despair finally came. The next day passed in a haze of suffocating silence. Her father left early for his office, and Clara avoided her, busying herself with mending and humming pointedly cheerful tunes. Lynn stayed in her room, the walls seeming to close in on her. Late in the afternoon, she heard a horse approach. Peeking through her curtain, she saw Arthur Vance dismounting in their front yard. Her heart leaped into her throat. He carried a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He knocked on the front door. Lynn heard Clara answer, her voice syrupy sweet. "Mr. Vance, what a surprise!" "Ma'am?" Arthur's voice was polite but distant. "I came to see Miss Lynn." "Oh, I'm afraid she's unwell today," Clara lied smoothly. "The excitement last night was too much for her." There was a pause. Lynn held her breath. "I see," Arthur said, his tone suggesting he didn't believe a word of it. "Well, would you please see that she gets this? Mrs. Henderson asked me to deliver it." Lynn heard the exchange of the bundle, another moment of polite talk, and then the sound of his horse riding away. A few minutes later, Clara appeared at her door without knocking. She tossed the bundle onto Lynn's bed. "The blacksmith's wife sent you a thank you," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "A jar of her peach preserves. I suppose you're the town hero now." She turned to leave, then paused. "Don't get used to it. Father is meeting with Mr. Abernathy this evening. He's going to fix the damage you've done." The words hung in the air long after Clara left. Fix the damage. Lynn knew what that meant. It meant more restrictions, more apologies, more of her own self being chipped away to appease men like Abernathy and her father. She unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a jar of sun-colored preserves and a small, folded note. It was not from Mrs. Henderson. The handwriting was heavy and deliberate. "He is asking after you. He says you have a gift. Don't let them take that from you. If you need a friend, I am north of town. The gate is never locked." It was unsigned, but it didn't need to be. Lynn read the words over and over, her fingers tracing the ink. The gate is never locked. It was more than an invitation. It was an offer of sanctuary, a validation of who she was, not who she was supposed to be. She folded the note and tucked it into the pouch inside her dress, next to the dried herbs. It felt like a seed of hope planted in barren ground. That evening, as promised, Mr. Abernathy's carriage arrived. Lynn watched from her window as the imposing man stepped down, his movements stiff and formal. He and her father sat in the parlor for over an hour. Lynn couldn't hear the words, only the low murmur of their voices. When Abernathy left, her father called for her. She entered the parlor to find him standing by the cold fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His anger from the night before had cooled into something far more dangerous, calculated resolution. "Mr. Abernathy was displeased with last night's events," he began, swirling the amber liquid. "However, he is a practical man. He has made a proposal to rectify the situation and allow our business to proceed." Lynn waited, a cold knot forming in her stomach. "He believes your public display indicates a lack of proper breeding and education. He has graciously offered to sponsor your enrollment at a ladies' seminary in San Francisco, a place for young Chinese women to be taught proper American customs." San Francisco. It was 1,000 miles away. An exile. She would be sent away, erased from Harmony Creek, her damage neatly disposed of. "You will be taught to be modest, to serve tea, to embroider," her father continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "You will be made into a suitable wife for a respectable Chinese merchant there. It is a very generous offer. You will leave on the morning stagecoach, 3 days from now." He said it all so calmly, as if discussing a shipment of goods. He was selling her, packaging her up and sending her away to fix his business deal. The little seed of hope from Arthur's note withered. Her father had won. He was caging her and shipping the cage across the country. For a moment, she could only stare at him, the full weight of his betrayal crushing her. She thought of her mother's garden, of the feel of the earth under her fingernails. She thought of Mr. Henderson's heartbeat steadying under her hand. And she thought of Arthur Vance's quiet eyes and his simple, powerful words. "Don't let them take that from you." Something inside her, something she thought had been extinguished long ago, ignited. "No," she said. The word was so quiet her father almost didn't hear it. "What did you say?" "No," she repeated, her voice clearer this time. "I will not go." He stared at her, his disbelief slowly turning to fury. "You will do as you are told. I am your father. This is not a request." "I am not a parcel to be traded," Lynn said, standing taller than she ever had in her life. "My place is here. My mother is buried here. My skills, the ones you call nonsense, they belong here, where they can be of use." "You have no skills that I recognize," he thundered. "You have nothing. You live under my roof. You eat my food. You will obey me." "Then I will no longer live under your roof," she said, the words coming from a place of courage she didn't know she possessed. She turned before he could respond and walked back to her room, her legs shaking but her resolve firm. She packed nothing. The white dress, the clothes her father had bought, they were part of the lie. She had only the simple dress she wore, her mother's hidden pouch, and Arthur's note. It was enough. She didn't wait for morning. Under the cover of darkness, she slipped out the back door and walked away from the house without a backward glance. The road stretched out before her, a pale ribbon under the moonlight. She turned north. 6 months later, the first snows of winter dusted the high peaks around Harmony Creek. The town was a different place for Lynn. She lived in a small room above Doc Miller's office. The doctor had returned from Bozeman to find the tale of the blacksmith's collapse on everyone's lips. He had sought Lynn out, not with suspicion, but with professional curiosity. He tested her knowledge, examined her herbs, and after a week of long conversations, he had offered her a position as his apprentice. "Your mother's knowledge and my books," he'd said, his eyes twinkling, "will make a formidable team." She had her own life now, her own small earnings. The townspeople no longer saw her as a strange shadow. They saw Lynn, the woman who worked with the doctor, the one whose hands were gentle and whose knowledge ran deep. They called her by her name. Her father had not spoken to her since the night she left. His deal with Abernathy had soured. Public opinion had quietly turned against the wealthy man after it became known he had tried to run Lynn out of town. Mr. Chin's freight business was struggling, his reputation tarnished not by his daughter's actions, but by his own. Clara had married a bank clerk and was said to be deeply unhappy. Arthur Vance came to town every Saturday. He no longer sat alone. He and Lynn would walk along the main street, speaking little but understanding much. The comfortable silence between them was a language all its own. His ranch was thriving, and he often brought her herbs he'd found in the high meadows, or simply came to sit with her on the porch of the doctor's office at the end of a long day. One crisp December afternoon, he arrived in his wagon as she was finishing her work. He wasn't empty-handed. He held out a satchel made of soft, sturdy leather, with small compartments stitched into the lining. "For your work," he said simply, "so you don't have to use that little pouch anymore." Lynn took it, her fingers brushing his. The leather was warm from his hands. She looked up at him, at his weathered face and his kind, steady eyes. The shy rancher who had seen a person where everyone else saw a ghost. In his gaze, she saw her future. It wouldn't be a life of shining, not in the way Clara or her father had meant. It would be something far better. It would be a life of quiet purpose, of shared strength, of a love that didn't need words to be true. It was a life she had chosen, a life she had earned, and it was more than she had ever dared to hope for. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.